welcome to the South Kohala Speaker Series. I'm Lauren Kupita, the coordinator of the partnership, and the goal of this speaker series is to provide an opportunity to learn more about the partners and the work being done. And the catalyst that started this partnership was that the State Division of Aquatic Resources and the Coral Working Group identified South Kohala as a priority area for the Hawaii Coral Reef Strategy to implement action to reduce anthropogenic impacts to the reef. Through community interest and engagement, the partnership was formed in 2012, and in 2000, over 30 organizations and agencies participating in the South Kohala Conservation Action Plan 2030 that outlines 6 specific strategies to guide the partnership's collaborative work towards restoring and protecting coastal resources. And one of these is the soil and watershed management strategy that the presentation today is directly connected to. And today we have Bryant Grady, a marine technician with the Nature Conservancy, and Bryant attended Hilo, and he also completed his master's with ASU in geography, with a focus on spatial analysis and marine ecology. And he assists with numerous projects with TNC, from coral restoration projects at Kohala, and he's very instrumental with our spatial analysis mapping and drone work with collaborative projects with partners. Bryant will be presenting Pelekane Vegetation Restoration Trials, Successes, Opportunities, and the Path Forward.
Awesome. Thanks for that great introduction, Lauren. Let me go ahead and I'll share my screen with everybody, and then I'll get going. All right. Can everybody see the presentation screen?
Can see it.
Awesome. Great. All right. Yeah. So as Lauren was saying, I'll be presenting on our restoration trials that we've been doing for the last few years up in Pelekane. And kind of the results, how we're moving forward with this, and some of the successes and lessons learned from those areas. So just as a brief introduction for everybody, introducing everybody to place, what the project was about. We did this in the Pelekane watershed that you can see outlined here in red. And this is about just under 14,000 acres. And what's really unique about this area is that it drains into a very narrow area on the coastline. So all of the rainfall, all of the sediment and erosion that occurs, it kind of comes out right there in Waihai Harbor area in a few really narrow gulches and ravines. And the rainfall and the kind of the ecosystems in this area at the coastline, it gets about 8 inches of rain, and towards Kohala Summit there, you can see in the dark green in the right corner, it gets about 120 inches of rain. Some of the major landowners that are in the area that we work with are Queen Emma Land Company, State of Hawaii, and the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. And so just kind of the why of why we did this, the need for vegetation restoration. This area is relatively prone to wildfires, overgrazing by ungulates. We were seeing worsening offshore water quality that were impacting reefs, mainly heavy sedimentation that were kind of going into that Pelekane Bay region and area, as well as just to preserve and establish conservation of some of Hawaii's really pristine and unique dryland and lowland grassland ecosystems that are only found here. So some previous work that has been done in the region by USGS, they did a really amazing study. They basically walked with a team of people the entire watershed and were able to categorize the ground cover of the different areas. So the map that you're looking at here are different ground cover categories, which are represented by the different colors throughout the watershed. And the main things to focus on here, and the main things that we're looking at, are these red areas that you can see kind of in the middle of this photo here, where it's this bare open soil, no vegetation, as well as the slightly darker orange areas, whereas there's still kind of this bare, slightly vegetated region. But these two main colors, the red and the lighter or the darker orange, are where we see a lot of erosion and a lot of sedimentation. coming from that come down the different ravines into the coastal environment. And so for this vegetation restoration trial, we decided that we were going to work in these dark red areas, in the theory that if we can get vegetation to grow in these different areas and we can restore effectively some of the vegetations, it should be able to work in the rest of the watershed in these areas that already have vegetation or already have some of those ecosystem services that are providing erosion control and sedimentation holding into the ground. So for the trial location where we decided to do this, we worked directly with Queen Emma Land Company in an area that's currently leased by Parker Ranch. And so you can see it's still in this lower section of the watershed. We looked for one of those areas that had that really high bare sediment. You can see in this area, there's lots of exposed, in this orange and the red, lots of exposed sediment and bare earth. And we began trials and baseline monitoring in 2020, around the end of the year, just before the rainy season. And so for the year of 2020, prior to the restoration starting, or the trials and baseline monitoring starting, we got about 10 inches of rain, which is pretty average for this section of the coastline and watershed. So our main project goals and what we were looking to get out of this, as well as the ways we assessed the success of the restoration treatments. The first thing, one of the major goals was looking at guidance for large-scale stewardship of the watershed, ways we can prevent erosion, we can assess flooding reduction, as well as ways we can restore vegetation that would implement those ecosystem services. We also wanted to restore things like biodiversity, uncommon native plant species that used to be in the watershed and that used to be very common in this area that may have been lost. And the three ways that we assess the success of the trials and of the different treatments that we applied. The first one was measuring seedling germination. So when we put a trial in, did we see the seedlings that we put in actually germinate, and were they successful? The second one was pretty simple. Did we see revegetation occur, and what was the overall increase of vegetation in that treatment? And then the last one was, if we did direct outplanting with seedlings or different species, did we see survival and growth of those species, or did we see any of those that particularly didn't work very well? And so just some hypotheses and ideas that we went into with these trials, things like soil tilling and direct planting, as well as treatments such as hydromulching with both native and non-native seed scattering. We kind of hypothesized that these different treatments would work better going into it, whereas treatments such as non-native seed scattering and native seed scattering would produce lower increases in vegetation, but still have an increased vegetation, but just lower compared to the previously mentioned ones. And so we kind of had these ideas of what we thought would work and what wouldn't work as well going into it, and we wanted to test which ones actually did in these different regions. So getting into the methods and what we actually did for this project for the vegetation trials, we did 10 different techniques to assess whether a vegetation trial worked, or these different vegetation treatments. The first one was direct planting with no soil preparation. We only did a small number of sample sizes for these ones, but we took a number of native species and we just put them directly into the ground. We also did soil tilling. So we took one of these chicken foot kind of soil tilling devices on a tractor, and we tilled the different areas of the trial restoration area, and then planted directly into that area with those same seedlings that we did in direct planting. We also did soil tilling with native seeds. So we tilled the section and then we seed scattered with a variety of different native species in that. After that, we did a section of coir logs, which are these just kind of mesh bags filled with a mulch material. It ranged from different types of coconut husk to a wood chip, but basically you lay them across a flow range, and it traps sedimentation across a landscape as it runs down, and it kind of builds up this fresh sedimentation layer, and then seeds can fall into that area and grow from that as well. We did a non-irrigated control plots. These were directly in the different trial areas, as well as a hydromulching technique. Hydromulching, it's sprayed kind of this litter material that was hydrated first over top of the different plots. And we tried this both with non-native buffalo grass seeds, which is one of the dominant grasses in the area, as well as we tried it with a native seed mix mixed in with the hydromulch as well. Lastly, we tried both a native seed scattering mix and a non-native seed scattering mix. The non-native seed scattering mix was mostly bufflegrass seed, which is the dominant grass that's up there already. And then we had a mix of different native seed species that were in the native one. And then we also did control plots outside the main fenced areas to test if we just monitored and didn't do any of these treatments, as well as we didn't do any fencing, what would it look like to be able to compare all of these different treatments. And so this is what the treatment site looked like. The yellow lined area is the fence that we had installed when the treatments went in for the different restoration trials. The different colors represent different types of the treatments that you can see in the legend there on the left. And then on the very far right, you can see those 10 different plot or 11 different plots on the right. Those are the control plots. All of the red plots in the center section of the fenced area, these are the irrigation control plots. So these are the areas that didn't get irrigation and were the control plots inside the fenced area. So we'll be able to check how the different trials compared both inside the fence and outside the fence. So the way we monitored to assess how these different trial techniques worked was we went out into the field after the treatments were installed about every 3 to 4 months, and we tracked the growth of all of these different treatment plots, the vegetation, as well as the seedlings that were put out. And this basically ranged from counting and measuring all of the different vegetation species and groups that were in each of these plots. So the timeline for what this looked like is we started our baseline surveys in November of 2020. We also did some drone imagery at this time as well, some high level just images of the trial area. We did baseline monitoring again in April of 2021. We also did the treatment installation at this time too. We did about 6 months of irrigation from the treatment installation to August of 2021, where we did another round of monitoring as well as another round of drone imagery of the area. And then we did regular monitoring quarterly till our last monitoring in October of 2022, where we also collected some imagery of the restoration sites there as well. So when we were doing the in situ work of the different vegetation surveys, we kind of broke it down into this general survey scheme. Each of the different treatments had a 5 by 2 meter plot that you can see here in black on the top right. And we took sample quadrats that were 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters, and we placed them on the right side, the middle, and the left side of the plot. And when we did this, we sampled all of the vegetations for 2 basic things. We looked at the nesting frequency, which is, you can see down here in the bottom. It's basically kind of a way to assess the probability of a seedling being in that plot or not. If you have a 1 for a nested frequency, there's a really low probability of that seedling of a plant species being highly probable in there, versus if you have a 5, because it's such a small area that you're assessing for, there's a higher probability or a like probability of it being there. Basically, if you have it here, it's really probable that it'll be in the rest of it. And then for percent cover to assess overall vegetation, we did these binned categories of percent cover of 1%, 1 to 5, 5 to 25, all the way up to 95 and 100% to just assess what's the vegetation percent cover for each of the different species that are found in the quadrats. So some of the results that we found for both of the ways that we assessed the restoration trials, starting off with ground cover. I'm just going to introduce everybody to these graphs really quick. You're going to see them pretty frequently over the next few slides. On the x-axis for all of these, we have the dates at which the surveys took place for monitoring, both before and after the treatments went in. On the y-axis for this graph, you're looking at the percent cover, and this particular set of data is looking at the ground cover of the different types of treatments. And each box is one of the different treatments. And on the bottom, you're looking at the different types of controls that we did, both inside the fence here on the left for irrigation control, and on the right in the unfenced section. The colors represent the different types of ground cover that we assessed for. And so on average, we found some interesting trends with the data, but on average, we had about 10% rock, 15% litter, and 75% bare earth before we began the trials. it's relatively representative of that landscape, what we're seeing. Nothing really major there in terms of new information. What we did find with the trials was, in particular, hydromulching showed some really interesting trends right away. You can see with the yellow arrows, with the first yellow arrows in each of these two boxes, we have this really large increase in hydromulch. So this, or in litter, and this is representative of that addition of the hydromulch. And what was interesting was we really determined the lifespan of hydromulch on in this type of environment and on this landscape. After about a year, a little bit over a year, you can see that the litter decreases again, and we go to that background or baseline levels that we determined before the trial started, which suggests that the hydromulch really only lasts about that like 1 year to a little bit longer in this landscape, which will have some different impacts on the success of those treatments into the future. So this plot is looking at the success of seedling germination. Again, I'll just introduce you to the axes in the graph. Same thing on the x-axis, we're looking at the dates of the monitoring. On the y-axis, we're looking at nesting frequency. And again, just to reference what nesting frequency is, if you have a 5, there's a really high probability of there being good germination, success, and a higher amount of seedlings in that plot, versus if you have a 1 or a 0, there's usually lower amounts of seedlings to no seedlings at all if you're at a 0. And so you're seeing like a 2 to a 3 average kind of number in a lot of these plots. That means that those are relatively present throughout these different treatments. So a couple things to notice right away. After we tilled the different treatments, so in the 2 till plant and till seed, we saw a lot of disruption in vegetation as expected when you till soil. But one of the things we noticed right away was that Kohala had a really fast establishment in these kind of like unearthed or tilled areas where there was loose soil where the seeds could get in and develop really strong root systems. In the beginning, we were a little bit worried about grasses not necessarily being able to establish themselves again very fast because we weren't seeing seedlings germinate very quickly in these areas. But towards the end of the monitoring, we started to see higher rates of germination with grasses, particularly things like peely grass started germinating in the tilled plots relatively well. Some things that we noticed that we found relatively interesting in terms of germination rates compared to our control plots. Both of the seed scattering treatments didn't produce major differences in terms of germination compared to our control plots. And this was interesting in the sense that we added a lot more seeds to that seed bank, but the established seed bank was so robust in terms of a lot of the things like buffalo grass and uhaloa, it didn't show that many differences from the addition of new seeds. What was really interesting in terms of hydromulching is we saw this really high increase of germination in hydromulching. The treatment went in April, and we immediately saw new seedlings establishing themselves within a few months. What was unfortunate with hydromulching is that with that shorter lifespan of about a year to a year and a few months, once that hydromulch was gone, you can see there's that dip again to that background or baseline levels of germination, and we kind of lost that rate of germination in those plots. So for changes in vegetation cover with the different treatments, again on this graph here, the x-axis is the dates for monitoring, the y-axis is percent cover. I'm going to show you 2 different versions of this type of data. This is similar to what we've been seeing, and the next will just be the change from the beginning to the end of the trials. But a couple of the big things to pull away from this is that when we did the tilling, we saw immediate disruption in vegetation. There was this drop from our initial baseline monitoring in November of 2020 to when we did the treatments in April of 2021. You can see that marked by the red arrows. But what was really interesting is after we got some pretty heavy rains, if you all remember, for the folks that are in South Kohala, in October of 2022, we had a really high rains right before we did this round of monitoring, and we saw an incredibly high growth in vegetation in the tilled plots, suggesting that when we loosen up the soil, we may provide some room for these plants to grow a little bit more, as well as some seeds to get in there and hold the soil or hold water in the soil a little bit better. So that was really interesting to see. The tilling also showed that the directly planted seedling plants survived better in the tilled plots than they did in just the direct planting plots. I'll get into this a little bit better, but you can see in the till plant, on that top left corner, you can see the native trees and the native shrubs did really well. A lot of this is from those direct plantings in the till plant section. Unlike the till planted and the till seed plot, where we have kind of this really slow growth and then a high boom, the hydro mulching sections show this really high increase in vegetation right in the beginning, and then this kind of steady state of vegetation increase after that. So between August 2021 and October of 2022, we have really similar levels with a slightly upward trend of vegetation growth, but not that much increase after that initial round of hydro mulching. And there's supposed to be, is there? And then in terms of buffle grass seeding or seed scattering plots, this is this top right corner buffle seed treatment. We're not really seeing that much of an increase in terms of buffle grass. So again, this was that treatment that was supposed to introduce buffalo grass into that section. But if we look at the baseline amount of buffalo grass to the end of the treatment, we're not seeing this above average increase in buffalo grass. So some of the seed scattering plots didn't necessarily, like we were seeing in previous germination plots, we're not seeing incredible amounts of vegetation growth like we were in terms of tilling or hydro mulching. So this graph, I'll kind of go over what it talks about. On the x-axis, we have the different types of treatments we did. So all 10 are here. On the y-axis, we have the change in percent cover from April of 2021 to October of 2022. The different letters above the different bars in the graph represent statistical significant differences between the different treatments. If you have the same letter in multiple treatments, those are similar to each other. If you have different letters in multiple treatments, those are different from each other. And then if you have two of the letters that are similar in two treatments, they're kind of that in between, they're similar to both treatments as well. So right off the bat, what we were seeing in those other plots as well, that we're seeing both in the analysis here, is that the till plant and the till seed had that highest increase. They were the most significantly different from all the other plots to the other treatments. So we're seeing till seed, till plant, really high levels of change over the course of the monitoring based on the treatments being done. The kind of second winners, that intermediate, they had increases in vegetation, but they weren't the highest, was the coir logs and the hydronative. In particular, hydronative had really high increases in native species, which makes sense. There's a lot of introduction of native seeds into that section. We're seeing a lot of peely grass. We're seeing a lot of uhaloa, as well as some aali'i germination in this area. So these ones worked well. And then lastly, we have the ones that did the same as our control plots. So things like buffle seed, hydro buffle, and then native seed scattering. These these treatments performed exactly the same as the irrigation control plots and the unfenced control plots. So these ones weren't as successful. What is important to note with this is that all of these treatments had increases in vegetation growth. None of these had that negative dip into a reduction in vegetation. So applying any one of these different treatments will increase vegetation over time. Even just letting a fenced area sit will increase vegetation in the watershed in Pelekane. But just to kind of give you guys a visual of what this looks like in terms of how some of these treatments work, particularly the hydromulch native seed, and then I'll show the till planted seed treatments in just a moment. So this is some of our drone imagery. It's a little bit fuzzy. It'll get a little bit better as we move through it, but this is one of the native seed plots. The kind of coral or salmon colored box is the actual plot that we surveyed in, and this is from November 18th of 2020. We move into August 21st of 2021, and we're seeing a lot of the hydromulch has moved in. You can see a lot of added litter, and especially in that middle to left section of this plot, as well as some greening of the plants in that right section of the plot. So a lot of kind of change there right away. But by the time we get to October 22nd of 2022, that last round of monitoring, you can see all of the hydromulch has dissipated or been washed out from this plot from either heavy rains or wind moving the hydromulch out. A lot of that litter that was producing that seedling germination has been displaced. We are seeing a lot of that fresh vegetation, especially in that right section of the plot. So it did increase vegetation, but again, that the litter that would help increase vegetation is already gone because of that lifespan of hydromulch. So same thing for one of the till planted plots. This is November of 2020, our baseline monitoring that we did, what it looked like before we did anything to it. We moved to August of 2021. The arrows are some of the seedlings that went in, some of the Ali'i and Kohala or Iliahi that we put into those plots. You can see some of the other seed or other plants that are already existing in those plots are kind of greening up and are there. You can also see the soil has been disrupted a little bit from the tilling that occurred in that section. And then we get to October of 2022, and you can see there's an exceptionally larger amount more of greening and vegetation in the plot compared to when we started, suggesting that the tilling has increased vegetation in the area, which was good to see. In terms of some of the direct outplanting with both the tilled plant and the direct outplanting seedling plots, these were the 5 species that we used for direct outplantings. The species choice had a lot to do with what was available at the time, with what we could use for the trials, as well as what worked in the region. There's a very wide list of species that we can add to this, but these are the 5 that we tested. To start off, Ali'i had a relatively standard restoration rate in terms of seedling outplanting. It was about 22% of the seedlings that survived from the beginning to the end of the monitoring period. Akia had it didn't do well at all in Pelekane. We found that it probably wouldn't work well for establishment, as there was a 0% seedling success rate. Kohala had the highest seedling success rate with 57%, which is a really amazing number in terms of restoration success in areas like Pelekane with 57%. It also showed a really strong growth throughout this entire time, with many of the trees tripling in size from the start of the trial to the end of the trial. Nio, we thought was going to do really well in the beginning. Everything was kind of holding on out there, as you can see on the graph in the bottom left. But by the time we got to October of 2022, we only had about 6%. There was about 1 plant that was left in the planted plots. And then Iliahi did really well in terms of restoration success, with again that 20 to 25% average range, which is kind of what we're looking for in most seedling outplanting. We didn't see crazy growth in terms of the height of Iliahi growing, but they did kind of bush out a lot more, and I'm sure we're going to see some height growth in the future with those trees going in. So that was good to see as well. So some main conclusions and takeaways that we found from this. Tilling and adding seeds to the tilled areas definitely worked the best. There was a lot of hesitation in the beginning, and we had a lot of planning discussions about how we were going to execute the tilling, as it can have a lot of soil disruption and have the potential to move sedimentation and create erosion in the areas. But despite this, we did find really successful revegetation in this particular trial. We did see a lot of disruption in the existing vegetation that was there, but again, we kind of went into the tilling plots knowing that that was going to happen. And then we did see a lot of natives re-establish themselves in those plots pretty close to immediately after tilling, as well as long-term establishment in these areas as well. Things like uhaloa and peely grass were really strong in doing that. The 3 main species that we found to have worked the best in this particular trial were Kohala, Iliahi, and Ali'i. All of them showed good survival rates, relatively well resilience in the dry periods, and then they grew a lot in those rainy months of the year. We did not try species such as Willy Willy or Aveo Veo. Both of those would work likely very well in Pelekane in this particular trial region, and would be a good choice in the future as well to add to those 3 that were discussed above. One thing to point out with tilling in addition to this is, while tilling was very successful in adding vegetation to this section of the watershed, the success kind of comes with a caution to it. Is these results don't necessarily suggest that we should go out and till all of the bare earth areas in Pelekane, as this would produce a really large amount of sedimentation and erosion to occur. But tilling can be done in relatively strategic places with a lot of planning and kind of measures involved to reduce that amount of erosion and sedimentation runoff to then increase vegetation. So it works really well, but it needs to be used with caution and a lot of planning when using this type of revegetation treatment. Hydro mulch produced a lot of initial seedlings, as you guys saw in the previous graphs. We did think it was going to have a really high success rate, and it did initially, but after we determined that it has that lifespan in the watershed, it kind of drops off, and the impact of this treatment, unlike some of the other ones, is relatively short. You get an impact time of about a year, slightly, maybe a little bit longer, and then it'll move into this. It's no longer, that treatment is no longer viable, and it's no longer adding to vegetation that's there. One of the things that we're kind of hypothesizing with hydromulching is it could need either longer irrigation or a higher amount of water added to it for a longer time. So this could potentially work higher up in the watershed where it gets more than that 10 inches of rain a year, to both hold the litter there or as well as rehydrate the litter that's there. And it might produce higher rates of germination and higher seedlings in those sections. So one of the things about seed scattering that we found was particularly interesting is it didn't increase the amount of vegetation compared to a lot of the control plots. We saw very few seedlings actually produced in terms of native seedlings in our seedling mix. There were a few, but not that many. This could be due to a wide variety of factors. Some of them are likely due to the fact that a lot of these seeds will remain dormant for a long period of time until they hit kind of a snap period where it's either activated by rain or fire, and then they'll germinate after that. But we may see these seedlings pop up in the future, but in the trial period over the course of the 2 years, we didn't see them germinate that often. The other likely thing that was occurring with this is we needed a higher volume of seeds to do seed scattering with. For particular species, it's the success rate in germination can be relatively low, so having a higher volume may increase that germination rate when seed scattering. So some of the next steps we're going to take within the restoration trials and ways we can move forward. One of the things we're looking at particularly right now is ways to monitor changes in the watershed and ways to scale up restoration and restoration monitoring. We're doing this a lot with working with drones with large area imagery as well as LiDAR techniques to measure ground cover change. This is an image on the screen here of the 2020 baseline imagery that we took. And you can see as we move through to 2020-21, we're able to really clearly see some of the additions. The fence line has gone in, the different treatments have gone in. And then as we move to 2022, at the end of this monitoring cycle, we see a lot more vegetation. And with this type of technology and analysis, we're able to really clearly monitor the vegetation growth as well as land cover changes here. So this is one of the ways we're going to be moving forward. One of the key aspects we're going to be looking at this with is some of the different vegetation indices that you can use. This is the VARI index for vegetation, which stands for Variable Atmospheric Reflective Index. And this basically looks at how much green is in a photo. So on the legend on the left, you can see it's on a scale of -1 to +1. +1 is very green for higher vegetation. A -1 will show bare soil or exposed earth. And then when you're around a 0, it's mostly like litter or organic debris that's not photoactive or photosynthesizing. And so we're going to use this moving into the future to get things like percent cover of vegetation, change in vegetation percent cover, and kind of monitor the restoration trials for the next few years with this technique to see how long-term, how these trials are impacting the region or how the vegetation changes. One of the other ways that we're really looking at assessing the area and for ways to future plan for restoration and target specific areas to do vegetation restoration. It's looking at erosion hotspot monitoring and cut fill analysis. So this is using techniques like LiDAR and structure from motion to really assess the differences in change in elevation height pixels from these maps. So in these two pictures on the presentation here, the areas in blue within that kind of red boxed area, those are areas where we see soil loss in those particular sections. So by using these and applying it at that landscape or watershed scale, we can target areas of the watershed that have a lot of loss and sedimentation, locate the sources and sinks of sedimentation and erosion, and then kind of do almost a rapid response or target those areas for revegetation to hold in the sediment in those areas. So I just want to say that this is kind of concluding the presentation. Huge thanks to everyone involved. This is kind of a short list of just a lot of the major people and parties involved who assisted. There's a much more comprehensive kind of working group on this that is always kind of giving advice, but I want to say a huge thanks to everyone involved beyond the people that are listed here. Yeah, with that, I will take any questions that anybody has. I'd be happy to talk about it. Stop sharing. Cool.
Thanks, Bryant. Does anybody have any questions for Bryant?
Yeah, I might as well just ask this, even though I think you probably made it pretty clear, but would you say that you feel that the hydromulching is definitely worth the effort? Because even though it doesn't persist, it seems like it still does give a boost to those seedlings in those early stages of germination.
Yeah, excellent question. I think that with hydromulching, and there's a lot of factors to involve about which technique can use there. I think with hydromulching and tilling, I'll kind of loop both into that same question. There's strategic areas that you can use for it to see where it works. It likely will benefit more in upper parts of the watershed where you get more rain, more water that'll hold it in place. With areas that don't see that as much, again, it's going to be one of those cost analyses that if it works for the area that you're working in, the funding is available, and we're seeing that increased growth in vegetation, it's worth it. But if you have to spend tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to reapply hydromulch and it only lasts a year, there are other things that will benefit. There are other treatments that did just as much that will last longer, kind of thing. That being said, if it proves to actually work higher up in the watershed and lasts longer than a year higher up in the watershed, I would say definitely it would be a benefit. There is an argument that could be made as well that if you did tilling and hydromulching at the same time, you could till an area, hydromulch the tilled area after the end of the rainy season, let that hydromulch kind of sit on that tilled area to hold the sediment in place until the new rainy season. And while some seedlings and vegetation was established, and kind of combining and picking and choosing the different treatments, that might work as well. We didn't test that hypothesis, but going into the future, that may be an option and something that can be looked into.
Awesome. Mahalo, Bryant.
Yeah, thanks, Bryant. Great presentation. That last point you made was the question I was going to ask, that the combination of the two very successful methods, especially in those high erosion areas from the drone imagery that you guys are identifying, the hot spots that are still providing a source of sediment to the reef. I think, that could be a nice thing to test out, of combining hydromulching and tilling, because it just seems so logical, right? Like the tilling helps, break up the soil to allow the roots to be able to penetrate easier. But then by hydromulching right after, you're speeding up the process to get the vegetation back on there. So you're making it less vulnerable for that tilling to cause, exacerbate or that's the wrong word, make the erosion worse in a short term. So, yeah, thanks for saying that. That seems like a really logical thing to try as we move forward.
Does anyone have any other questions or comments for Bryant? Well, oh,
I was just going to say how beautiful the drone imagery is, and what a beautiful story it tells. Those images you showed at the end, I think, are just really, really bring the point home of how amazing it is that the partners have been working to restore this area. And, just seeing those pictures really just highlights how successful this project has been, working with the ranchers and the landowners to really reduce the threat of erosion to the reef. And thank you so much for collecting that imagery and helping tell that story.
Yeah, it's a great tool for that kind of before, during, and after. Beyond the data analysis part, just the base imagery tells, like, being able to see that It's so much more powerful than looking at a graph and seeing it. Just you can see the change in vegetation, which is really cool.
Yeah, Becca, thanks for saying that. I really appreciate the pictures to really tell that story. Any other questions or comments? Well, Bryant, I want to thank you for your time and sharing about this project. And this recording will be tied to the South Kohala website and our YouTube page for future viewing. And thanks everybody for coming.